Throughout his teens, my Grandpa Joe was a hunter and a trapper. Back then it was a practical pursuit. A man could sweat all day plowing or clearing brush and make $1.50, or he could hunt his trap line at night and earn $15. I mean, when raccoon pelts were selling for $5 and nice beaver pelts were bringing as much as $9, a man's dog and his .22 rifle were his bread and butter. And Grandpa loved the forest around his old home place. The old oak and hickory trees, the deep cellars or ravines where you could find fuller's earth, the well-worn trails, and the secret ways that he found. The whisper of the wind in the treetops, and the silent Mattaponi River. Grandpa Joe would head into the woods after supper in the evening with a lantern, his rifle, and his dog, Driver. Well, Driver was a coon dog, and he knew his business. He and Joe would hunt until dawn, and when it was light enough, Joe would check his traps on the way home for beaver and muskrat and maybe even a mink. Well, one evening, Driver got scent of an old wily raccoon, and he gave chase. Now, a raccoon will usually head for a tree where he can escape the dog, but he couldn't escape Joe's .22, not up in the tree. But this old raccoon didn't go for a tree. He kept moving farther and farther away, heading for the river. Well, Joe tried to keep up, but Driver was in hot pursuit. And then suddenly, Driver's baying stopped, and Joe became frantic. He realized what had happened as soon as he came in sight of the river. The coon had run into the water, and Driver had jumped in after him. And then the old raccoon had turned on Driver and had climbed up on his head and was clinging to him and trying to force his head underwater and drown him. Well, Driver was tiring quickly and would soon not be able to keep his head up. So Joe started stripping off his clothes as he ran toward the river. He put his lantern down and kicked off his shoes and pants and jumped right in after Driver. Well, Joe had just about reached the dog when the coon decided that 2 against 1 was not going to end in his favor. So the coon let go and swam to the opposite bank. And Driver swam back to the bank he started from. And Joe suddenly remembered that he didn't know how to swim. Well, the Mattaponi was probably 25 or 30 yards wide at this point, not too big, and Joe realized the south bank was now closer than the north bank from which he started. So in an adrenaline-fueled rush, he made it to the south bank and climbed out. When he caught his breath, Joe took stock of his situation. Across the river in the light of the lantern over there, he could see his clothes, his shoes, and his rifle. The Driver was off and gone in pursuit of some other quarry. It was shaping up to be a long night. Now Joe could have jumped back into the river and swum across, gotten dressed and taken off after Driver. But there was no way he was going to risk the river again, not with his poor swimming skills. And the closest bridge was at Aylett, about a mile downstream. So Joe walked barefoot, naked, and without light through the woods to Aylett, crossed the river on the bridge, and walked back to the spot from which he had started on the far bank. And though he loved to tell this story when he was older, it was some time before Joe told anybody about this embarrassing adventure. And I can imagine Peter in today's gospel reading feeling the same embarrassment as Grandpa. Peter walked on the water, a feat Grandpa would have envied, Peter stepped out of the wind-tossed boat and onto the rough surface of the sea, and he walked to Jesus on the water. But once he got to Jesus, he looked around and saw the waves and the spray, and he heard the howling wind, and he became afraid. And immediately he began to sink, and he cried out, "Lord, save me!" So Jesus reached out and caught him. "O man of little faith," Jesus asked, Why did you doubt?" I'm not sure, but it might have been around this time that Jesus and the other disciples started calling Peter the Rock, based on the way he swam. But embarrassed or not, Peter demonstrated an important spiritual principle in today's lesson. When he stepped out of the boat and walked on the surface of the water, Peter was doing that seemingly impossible feat simply because he believed he could. Jesus in that moment did not do or say anything to make Peter different from anyone else. Peter said, "Lord, if it is you, bid me to come to you on the water." And Jesus looked at him and simply said, "Come." Peter walked on the water because he believed he could. When he ceased to believe it, he sank. And that's why Jesus asked him, "Why did you doubt?" Peter didn't lose faith in Jesus. He called out to Jesus to save him because he knew Jesus could save him. Peter lost faith in himself, his own ability, his own worthiness to emulate his Lord. His fear crippled his will, and Jesus saved him. And I find it immensely comforting to know that he would do the same for me and for you. The hard part was not the walk. It was the first step. That step out of the boat. That safe, though storm-tossed boat. But Peter took that step. He climbed out of the boat, placed his feet onto the water, and that's what I'm not sure I could do. And consider the faith that took. The complete lack of fear. The absolute lack of uncertainty. I mean, granted, Peter was looking into the eyes of Jesus as he took that step. And that had to have helped. But he still had to have tremendous faith to even attempt what he did. But whatever faith Peter displayed that evening, he could not deny that he had faltered and had to be saved by Jesus. I mean, was his embarrassment like what Grandpa Joe felt? I don't know. The gospel doesn't say. But I like to think Peter overcame his doubt. I have a theory that his faith grew stronger, that Christ had chosen him wisely. In the 21st chapter of the Gospel of John, Peter and some other disciples had grown tired of waiting for Jesus. I mean, he'd been crucified and buried, and his body had disappeared. And an angel had told the women to tell the disciples to go to the Sea of Galilee, and he would meet them there. So far, no Jesus, and they weren't even sure he was going to show up. So they went fishing on the Sea of Galilee. They fished all night. And in the morning, Jesus came walking along the beach and hailed them with some friendly advice about where to cast their nets. Well, John recognized Jesus, and he told Peter, "It is the Lord." And then verse 7 continued, "When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his clothes, for he was stripped for work, and sprang into the sea. Now this passage has always puzzled me. Why did Peter put on his clothes to swim ashore? Most folk strip off clothing before jumping into the water. But Peter put his clothes on. Now my theory, which is not fully or in any way supported by the accompanying scriptures, is that Peter put on his clothes, and instead of jumping into the water, he stepped out of the boat as he had done once before. He stepped out of the boat onto the surface of the water and ran ashore once more into the arms of Jesus. And this is what Christ calls us to do. Give up our embarrassment. Let go of our fear and doubt. Leave behind the security of our storm-tossed lives and spring out of the boat. Run to meet him. Have him catch us in his arms. Cry out for him to save us. And trust that he will. Amen.